Imagine you are driving up the Pacific Coast Highway, windows down, salt air pouring into the car. To your right, the Pacific stretches out in endless blue, waves crashing against long strips of sand. To your left, glass-wrapped mansions cling to the cliffs, sun bouncing off infinity pools and terracotta roofs. It feels like the purest version of the California dream, a world where nothing truly bad could happen. But as you start to notice the for sale signs, the price reductions, and the homes that have been sitting for months, a different picture comes into focus. Beneath the postcard views, a serious shift is underway. What was once a confident seller's playground is quickly turning into a financial minefield for anyone who is not paying attention. Inventory is building at a pace not seen since the last major downturn, and insurance companies are stepping back from the most vulnerable parts of the coast. Today on Discover the Nation, we are taking a full coastal road trip from the southern edge of the state up through some of the wealthiest zip codes in the country to uncover what is really happening in this high-stakes housing market. We will look at where investors are quietly backing away, where owners feel trapped by carrying costs, and where the luxury bubble has already burst. By the end, you will see why buying along this stretch of shoreline without understanding these risks could be one of the most expensive decisions of your life. If you want to stay ahead of these changes and protect your financial future, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Discover the Nation. We dive into the real numbers behind the dream so you can make informed decisions, not just emotional ones. Now let us start the engine and head to our first stop.
Number 10. Oceanside. Our journey begins at the northern edge of San Diego County, in a city that was once branded as the last realistic beach town in the region. When you exit the highway into Oceanside, you see polished new developments, a refreshed pier district, trendy cafes, and walkable blocks that suggest steady prosperity. On the surface, it looks like everything is still booming. The housing data tells a more uneasy story. Active listings have climbed sharply over the past year, with many homes sitting much longer than they did during the bidding war era. Properties that would have gone under contract in a weekend are now lingering as inventory stacks up. Sellers are learning they are not alone. They're competing against rows of similar homes, often in the same price band, all chasing a smaller pool of buyers. Recent sales figures show that median prices have begun to soften. On paper, a decline of only a few percent from last year may not sound dramatic, but for recent buyers, it represents tens of thousands of dollars in evaporated equity in a short amount of time. Days on market have stretched past a month and a half on average, a sharp contrast to the frantic conditions of just a couple of years ago. The rental side offers few easy answers. Vacancy rates in some apartment and short-term rental segments have nudged higher, especially where investors assumed endless tourism demand. Higher interest rates and elevated operating costs have eroded returns. Some owners who bought at the top of the market counting on constant bookings are discovering that their numbers no longer work. County data also shows an uptick in early-stage distress, including more delinquent loans and an increase in foreclosure filings compared to recent lows. That does not mean every neighborhood is in crisis, but it does mean the stress is real. Oceanside still benefits from a strong military presence, ocean access, and a desirable climate, but those fundamentals are now colliding with the reality of high borrower costs and changing demand. If you are considering this area, patience may be your greatest asset. Watching how this inventory wave resolves could make the difference between overpaying in a delicate market and entering at a more sustainable level.
Number 9. Long Beach. Heading north into Los Angeles County, you arrive in a city that has always blended working ports, dense urban neighborhoods, and coastal views. Long Beach has long been a place where industrial reality and oceanfront promise meet in the same skyline. Today, that complexity is spilling directly into the housing market. Along the waterfront, high-rise towers and older mid-rise buildings dominate the view. Many of these homes look like the perfect lock-and-leave lifestyle, but for a growing number of owners, they have become expensive obligations. Monthly carrying costs in certain buildings include not only a mortgage, but substantial association dues and rising insurance premiums. In recent years, several large insurers have reassessed their exposure in coastal and high-density zones, tightening terms or declining to renew some policies. When coverage becomes harder to secure or significantly more expensive, buyers factor that directly into what they are willing to pay.
At the same time, association boards have had to raise fees in some complexes to cover higher insurance costs, building maintenance, and new safety requirements. Sales volume across the city has slowed compared to prior years, a sign that buyers are pushing back at current price and cost levels. Condo inventory in particular has been sitting longer, with many units taking well over a month to find a buyer. Price cuts have become more common as sellers adjust expectations. The cumulative effect is a market that feels heavier, where pricing is less about aspiration and more about what a smaller group of qualified buyers will actually support. There are also signs of hidden supply. Some owners test the market, fail to get their asking price, and quietly withdraw their listings, preferring to wait rather than accept a lower offer. At the same time, data on delinquencies shows a modest but noticeable increase, indicating that at least a portion of homeowners are finding it harder to keep up. Long Beach still offers jobs, transit access, and variety in housing types, but the days when nearly any unit could find a quick buyer at a premium appear to be over. For anyone considering a purchase, especially in a high-rise or large association, a careful review of fees, reserves, insurance conditions, and long-term maintenance plans is no longer optional.
Number 8. Ventura. Continuing up the coast, the landscape becomes more rugged, the hills move closer to the water, and you enter a classic surf town that has long balanced blue-collar roots with a rising cost of living. Ventura has historically attracted residents who wanted a quieter alternative to the big city without giving up coastal access. Over the last cycle, however, home prices in the area outpaced what many local incomes could reasonably support. By some measures, the share of households able to afford a median-priced home fell to very low levels. When that happens, the pool of buyers depends increasingly on equity-rich newcomers and investors rather than people who live and work nearby. Recent data shows that closed sales have pulled back compared to prior years, while the number of active listings has grown. Many of the homes coming to market belong to long-term owners looking to cash out after substantial gains, but they are discovering that the next generation of buyers is not willing or able to pay peak prices. As a result, properties sit longer and seller confidence erodes. On the rental side, growth has flattened. In some segments, asking rents have even dipped slightly, especially where new supply has entered the market or where renters, facing broader cost pressures, have doubled up or moved farther inland. Without strong rental growth, investor interest cools, removing another source of demand that previously propped up values. Coastal risk sits in the background of every decision here. Concerns about erosion, storm damage, and future sea level rise influence insurance rates and long-term planning. Policies have become more expensive in some locations, and buyers are increasingly scrutinizing hazard disclosures before committing to a purchase. Ventura remains a scenic and appealing place to live, but the math has tightened. For prospective buyers, it is essential to weigh not just the asking price, but also income-to-price ratios, local job trends, and the ongoing costs of owning in a region where nature can reshape the shoreline over time.
Number 7. Carlsbad. Looping back toward the North County coast, you reach a city known for its flower fields, master-planned neighborhoods, and family-friendly image. Carlsbad became one of the emblematic winners of the remote work boom, attracting professionals who could suddenly choose sunshine and coastal paths over long commutes in crowded cores. During those years, demand surged. Homes in certain communities sold quickly at rising prices, and sellers rarely needed to offer concessions. That environment has changed. As more companies have shifted toward hybrid policies and required at least some office presence, the appeal of living far from job centers has become more complicated. Some households are now reconsidering whether long drives and higher coastal costs still make sense. Market indicators reflect that adjustment. Measures of buyer demand have shifted from a strong seller advantage toward a more balanced or even buyer-leaning position. A growing share of active listings now show price reductions compared to their initial list numbers, a clear signal that sellers overshot and are being pulled back by reality. Median prices remain high by national standards, but they have begun to ease as more properties sit without immediate offers. The upper tier has been particularly affected. Large homes and luxury properties that once moved relatively quickly now can sit for many weeks or longer. Owners who financed at adjustable or higher-rate loans are especially sensitive to holding times. Short-term rental dynamics are another pressure point. As destinations compete for a finite pool of travelers and local regulations evolve, occupancy and nightly rates can become less predictable. Investors who counted on peak season revenue to cover year-round expenses are now recalculating, and some are choosing to exit. Carlsbad still offers strong schools, coastal amenities, and a polished lifestyle, but anyone considering a purchase now faces a more complex equation. It is no longer enough to assume that future buyers will always be willing to pay more simply for proximity to the ocean and a home office with a view.
Number 6. Huntington Beach. Traveling north again, you arrive in a city that proudly brands itself as Surf City, a place where wide beaches, long piers, and steady waves have defined the culture for decades. The image is relaxed, but beneath it, the housing market is undergoing its own quiet struggle, one that local agents say has been building for several seasons rather than a sudden shift. Over the last several years, rising prices and cost of living have pushed many longtime residents to consider leaving. Net migration figures show more people moving out of some coastal zones than moving in, especially when they can sell a home and stretch those proceeds in lower-cost states. That outflow has left more properties on the market at the same time, with buyers becoming more selective and more sensitive to monthly payments than they were during the low-rate era. Recent data shows that the number of homes listed for sale has grown compared to previous years, while the pace of sales has slowed. Where homes once sold in roughly a month, they now often remain active for close to 2. In some submarkets, average days on market have ticked even higher, particularly for older stock needing upgrades. For investors, that extended holding period erodes returns and increases carrying costs, such as taxes, insurance, and maintenance. Insurance has become a central concern. Changes in federal flood mapping and evolving assessments of coastal risk have led to higher mandatory policy costs in some neighborhoods. For homeowners near low-lying areas, that can mean new or larger annual premiums that add thousands of dollars to already high expenses, and in some cases require switching to specialized or surplus carriers with stricter terms. At the same time, aging housing stock in some parts of the city requires significant renovation to meet modern expectations or updated codes. Buyers factor in those future costs, negotiating more aggressively or choosing newer inland options instead. Mortgage application statistics suggest fewer households are willing to stretch into the highest price tiers, especially with borrowing costs elevated compared to a few years ago and consumer confidence more cautious. Huntington Beach still delivers on lifestyle and brand, but the financial dynamics have shifted. For many, it is no longer an automatic choice, but one option among several, weighed against taxes, utilities, insurance, commute patterns, and the risk of further policy changes that could raise ownership costs again.
Number 5. Dana Point. Further down the coast, you enter a harbor town framed by cliffs and marinas, long known for resort hotels and ocean view neighborhoods. Dana Point invested heavily in upgrading its waterfront and surrounding streets, aiming to attract a new wave of high-end buyers and visitors. For a time, that strategy appeared to work, supported by strong tourism numbers and brisk luxury sales recorded in local reports. The upper price bands saw significant appreciation as second home and luxury buyers competed for limited inventory. Renovated properties with modern finishes and strong views commanded premium listing prices. However, as interest rates rose and borrowing large sums became more expensive, the already narrow pool of buyers who could comfortably afford multi-million-dollar homes grew smaller, and some shifted their attention to inland or out-of-state markets. Current data shows a buildup of listings in the higher price ranges, especially between $3 and $5 million. The supply of homes in that bracket now represents many months of inventory at the current sales pace, which is generally considered favorable to buyers rather than sellers. Closing data also indicates that more properties are selling below their original ask, as sellers accept that the market will not support peak pricing and adjust expectations after several price changes. Jumbo loan activity, which is critical in this segment, has slowed, leaving a larger share of transactions to all-cash purchasers. Those buyers tend to be more disciplined. They compare potential returns here against other asset classes and increasingly demand discounts in exchange for tying up capital, often leveraging detailed inspections and appraisal data to justify lower offers. The age of the local housing stock adds another complication. Many homes built several decades ago now require substantial updates to systems, exteriors, and interiors. That work can be costly near the coast, where materials and labor often command premiums. For some potential buyers, the combination of a high entry price and anticipated renovation budget is enough to push them toward other markets where newer construction is available at similar price points. Dana Point's views remain impressive, but the path to a financially sound purchase has narrowed. This is a market that rewards deep due diligence and a long time horizon, not quick speculative bets. And it increasingly favors buyers who treat the purchase like a business decision rather than a purely emotional one.
Number 4. Laguna Beach. Just a short drive north, you arrive in an arts-focused coastal enclave built into steep hillsides above small coves and beaches. Laguna Beach has long been one of the most recognizable and aspirational communities on this coastline, with a reputation shaped by galleries, festivals, and limited space for new construction. In recent years, however, the housing market here has entered a kind of stalemate. Asking prices for many properties remain extremely high, reflecting both location and scarcity. Yet buyers, even those with substantial resources, are increasingly questioning whether these numbers reflect long-term value in light of climate risk, insurance challenges, and broader market volatility. Some high-net-worth purchasers have reportedly shifted to diversifying across multiple regions rather than concentrating funds in a single expensive coastal property. Sales volume has fallen from previous peaks, with fewer transactions closing in a typical year. That does not mean that prices have collapsed across the board, but it does indicate a lack of liquidity. When homes do sell, they often do so after longer marketing periods and sometimes at reduced prices relative to initial expectations, especially if they require extensive updating or sit in more exposed locations. Insurance is a critical part of the story. Laguna Beach sits at the intersection of coastal exposure, steep terrain, and regional wildfire concerns. Several large carriers have tightened their underwriting standards for these types of risks, and some owners have had to rely on state-supported or specialized coverage options. These policies tend to be more expensive and less flexible, and may come with higher deductibles or coverage caps that concern lenders. For buyers dependent on financing, the ability to secure acceptable insurance is a key condition of closing. For current owners, the combination of sizable property taxes, elevated insurance costs, and maintenance demands on hillside homes can strain even comfortable budgets. For prospective buyers, the question becomes whether the prestige and setting justify ongoing expenses in a market where exit options may not always be easy and where future regulation could further limit building or rebuilding rights. Laguna Beach remains visually stunning and culturally rich, but it also illustrates how a prized zip code can run into very real constraints when risk assessments and cost structures change. The narrative has shifted from simple aspiration to careful calculation about resilience, liquidity, and long-term policy trends.
Number 3. Newport Beach. Continuing along the shoreline, you reach a harbor city known for its islands, yachts, and carefully manicured streets. Newport Beach represents a pinnacle of coastal status in Orange County, with some of the highest property values in the region and a long track record of attracting wealth from across the country. During the last run-up, prices in many neighborhoods climbed far beyond what local rents could justify on a traditional investment basis. That disconnect was less noticeable when interest rates were low and buyers were more focused on lifestyle than return. As borrowing costs rose and alternative investments offered more attractive yields, the opportunity cost of tying large sums into low-yielding property became harder to ignore, particularly for investors who track total return across their portfolios. Recent data reveals that investor purchases have slowed significantly compared to the height of the cycle. Many buyers in the current market are either long-term owners trading within the area or cash purchasers looking for end-use properties rather than short-term returns.
Listing statistics show that homes, particularly those priced in the upper millions, are spending more time on the market. Price reductions, while not dramatic in every case, have become more common as sellers adjust to a smaller active buyer pool and appraisals reflect more conservative assumptions. Short-term rental regulations have also evolved. Stricter permitting and enforcement in some neighborhoods have limited the ability of owners to rely on vacation rental income to offset carrying costs. Meanwhile, insuring older structures near the water against flood and storm-related risks has grown more expensive, adding to the annual cost of ownership and making pro forma cash flow projections less attractive. For those with deep resources and a long horizon, Newport Beach will always hold appeal as a lifestyle choice. For others evaluating it through an investment lens, the numbers now demand closer scrutiny. The combination of high acquisition prices, modest yields, and rising ongoing costs makes this a market where prestige alone cannot carry the equation, and where patience and careful entry pricing are increasingly important.
Number 2. Santa Monica. Driving north into Los Angeles County again, you reach one of the most famous coastal cities on the planet. The pier, the promenade, and the broad beach have made Santa Monica an international symbol of the West Coast lifestyle. Behind that image, however, the economic foundation has been shifting in ways that show up first in leasing reports and transaction logs rather than tourist photos. The commercial core has faced rising vacancies in offices and some retail spaces in recent years. As fewer workers commute into the area and some businesses downsize or relocate, daytime foot traffic and local spending patterns change. That, in turn, affects the perceived value of living close to downtown, particularly for residents who once justified higher housing costs with short walks to work and amenities. On the residential side, new tax policies targeting high-value property sales have influenced the luxury market. For owners of more expensive homes, the prospect of paying additional transfer taxes when they sell can be a significant factor in deciding whether to list. Some choose to delay or explore complex workarounds, which can make transactions more difficult to structure and finance, and may reduce the number of clean, straightforward deals. Home prices remain elevated, but recent data shows modest year-over-year declines in some segments and longer days on market in others. Areas more heavily affected by visible street-level challenges, including encampments and safety concerns, have seen steeper discounts as buyers price in perceived quality of life issues and potential future policy changes. Inventory has risen from prior lows as more owners look for alternatives in nearby communities that they view as calmer or more predictable. At the same time, the cost of owning here has not fallen in step with sale prices. Property taxes, association fees where applicable, and insurance costs remain considerable, and utility and maintenance expenses reflect both older building stock and coastal wear. Santa Monica still offers amenities, climate, and access that few places can match, but the trade-offs have become sharper. Buying here now requires a clear view of how evolving tax structures, urban conditions, and work patterns might shape the city over the next decade, not just a snapshot of how it looked when the market was at its peak or on a postcard.
Number 1. Malibu. Our final stop brings us to an iconic stretch of coastline that has defined the idea of exclusive oceanfront living for generations. Malibu's cliffs, coves, and beachfront homes are instantly recognizable around the world. Yet this same geography that makes it so desirable also exposes it to some of the most serious risk on the entire coast, both physical and financial. In recent years, the private insurance market for high-risk properties here has contracted significantly. Major carriers, faced with repeated wildfire seasons, landslide incidents, and ongoing erosion, have reduced their willingness to write new policies or renew certain existing ones. Many owners have turned to state-supported or specialty insurers as a last resort, often at very high premiums and with limited coverage. In some cases, policies come with substantial deductibles that effectively make smaller claims uneconomical. These developments have profound implications for real estate. When it becomes difficult or extremely costly to insure a home, especially a high-value one, the pool of qualified buyers shrinks.
Lenders typically require adequate coverage as a condition of issuing or renewing a mortgage. If insurance cannot be arranged on acceptable terms, sales can fall through or never get off the ground, regardless of how attractive the home might appear. Data on sales volume shows a marked slowdown in transactions compared to prior years. Listings at the top end of the market, which once moved quietly through private networks or fetched record prices, now often remain on the market for extended periods. Price reductions, sometimes in very large amounts, are increasingly common as sellers confront a smaller audience of potential buyers who are willing to accept both the financial and physical risks of owning property here. Coastal erosion magnifies the uncertainty. Reports from geologists and planning agencies have highlighted areas where the shoreline is retreating or where bluffs show signs of instability. For homes perched close to the edge, questions about long-term viability are no longer theoretical. Those concerns influence both lender decisions and buyer psychology and can lead to more conservative appraisals even when a property appears structurally sound today. Malibu remains breathtaking, but it is also a clear example of what happens when luxury real estate meets climate pressure, insurance retreat, and shifting risk tolerance. For many, the views will always be worth the cost of a hotel stay or a short-term rental. Owning, however, is a very different equation that now demands careful attention to coverage, regulations, and long-term exit strategies as much as to scenery.